Welcome, welcome. What a remarkable and wonderful turnout. It's so exciting. So exciting for me, I guess, too, because we've really been working on having Ms. Nazario, shall we say? We'll do it that way, Ms. Nazario, come to this campus for a couple of years, really. The book was selected a couple of years ago for the Common Reading Experience. So students are reading it right now, really. How many of you are reading this book right now? Raise your hands. Okay, lots of you. So we're very pleased to have her, and there are many individuals I could thank. I know that Erin Abeda worked hard to combine, to find a way to combine the travels so that Ms. Nazario could be here. And she's been in Denver, where on Tuesday this book was just announced as their selection for the One Book, One Denver read for the coming year. And at first I said, well, congratulations to you, and then I said, and how fortunate for Denver. What a great choice, what a great choice. The other thing she mentioned is that she had also just been speaking to about 200 migrant educators, and when I was taking a little time to look into what she does in addition to all of the work she does with journalism and book writing, she's active also in on many boards and in many efforts involving education and access. One of them, I want to get the name right. Catch the Next is the group, I think, that is a nonprofit with the purpose to double the college enrollment numbers of Latino students. Outstanding effort there. She's been reporting and writing about social issues for about 20 years. She was the special projects reporter for the LA Times when she wrote the articles that led to this book. Enrique's journey won as feature writing the Pulitzer Prize. She's also won the George Polk Prize for International Reporting, the Grand Prize, Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Prize, the Guillermo Martinez Marquez Award for Overall Excellence. Really so many awards for her books, her articles, her journalism, and then also the activism in these social issues. I've shared with my students, and those of you who have read the preface, we've talked about, she says in the prologue here that she is not a brave woman, and I said, but I remember from The Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz that courage is not thinking that, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of, I'm not afraid, but acknowledging that you're taking great risks and you may feel fear, terrible fear, and you act anyway. And I think that that's one of the things that makes having Ms. Nazario here so important and so extraordinary. This is someone that I think has exceptional courage, courage of convictions. I don't know, my students will probably be asking you about that. The book, if you don't have your hands on it, is a riveting and moving book to read. Very powerful. I think it will change you if you haven't read it, and as you progress, you'll find that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for that very overly kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be at Adams State, a Hispanic serving institution, which is awesome. The first one, I think, in Colorado. And And my husband's family is from Colorado, and so they have taught me that there is a real need in Colorado to educate people about immigrants and the immigration issue. And I probably shouldn't go further than that, but I've definitely felt this issue personally here in Colorado, and I've spent a lot of time traveling through Alamosa. His family are fishermen, and we often go to Lake City and Creede. We drive from Los Angeles, where I live, so I've picked up meals and lattes here more times than I can count. So it's delightful to be able to come and stop for once. We're in kind of a very predictable time in terms of the reaction towards immigrants. And I want to talk just very briefly and then read a few passages and then let you guys ask questions, because I tend to talk too much. But we're in a very predictable time in terms of this reaction, whether it was, the 1880s when the economy slumped and we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, in the 1930s during the Great Depression when the economy went south. We deported between 400,000 and 1 million Mexicans. Half of them were actually citizens of this country. More recently with the economic recession, we've seen this very predictable pattern of when times are tough and there aren't very many jobs, and Colorado still has more than 8% unemployment. We tell people to go home, and when times are better, we welcome them because we need their hands and their labor. And so there's been this very predictable pattern that we've seen, and we're kind of in the middle of that. Since writing Enrique's journey, some things have kind of changed in terms of this story. The number of children coming has actually doubled over the last year. And that's because, and we've seen, now there are 53 shelters in the United States just for children coming into this country alone. Those are spread out throughout 12 states. I calculate that there's approximately 100,000 children coming from Mexico and Central America without a parent now. And there are a lot of reasons for that increased violence in Central America. Part of that is our drug consumption and what's happening with drug routes, and a lot of those drugs now traveling through Central America, and gang violence, and they're increasingly recruiting. They don't give you a choice. If you're a 12-year-old boy, they say you're going to join, or we're going to kill you, or we're going to kill and rape your sister. And so we see kids fleeing because of that. But also, as there's been more and more border enforcement, we've kind of locked people in who have come here. They call it the caging effect. So all these migrants who have come here unlawfully, at least they come here with the thought that they're going to be able to go back and forth, and now they don't even have that illusion, as with the border crackdown and things have gotten so much harder and so much more expensive to travel across the border. So they're bringing their children more readily than they would before, especially girls, which are kind of the last to be brought, because even if you bring a girl with a smuggler, you get passed from, it's not one smuggler, you get passed from smuggler to smuggler. Because each smuggler in Mexico knows their territory, they've bought off the cops in their area, so you could get passed between 3 or 4 smugglers coming to the United States, and too often those smugglers will rape you, even if you're paying, the girls, even if you're paying for their services. So it's a time of enormous turmoil on this issue of immigration. We've reached the lowest number of border apprehensions, people being caught coming into the United States, is down to about 340,000 a year now, and that's the lowest since the 1970s. At the high, it was about 1.6 million a year. So there's been a real drop in people coming and being apprehended, but there's been an enormous surge in people being deported as well. You've seen this parade of Latino faces at the Democratic National Convention, and in part that's to make up on Obama's part for the fact that he has deported more people since he has been president than any other president in this nation's history. He's deporting about 400,000 people per year. That's increased by about 1/3 over the Bush administration. So fewer people coming and more people being deported. And what we've seen is also on the state and local level, there was a feeling that when these numbers of migrants surged over the last 20 years who were coming to the United States, really the biggest wave of immigration in our nation's history occurred over the last 20 years. And increasingly, as the recession hit, there was this feeling that the federal government was doing nothing about this. And so state and local entities have increasingly taken this into their own hands, and they've just whipped up a huge number of laws to try to deal with this in one way or another. Since 2005, states alone have passed more than 1,000 laws trying to deal with the immigration issue. They prohibit people from renting apartments, from getting jobs. They do a whole variety of things. If you're in South Carolina or in Georgia, there are laws, if you're undocumented, that will not allow you to go on to higher education. You can't go to public college, even if you pay out-of-state tuition. And even though the state knows they're going to make money off of you paying out-of-state tuition, they won't let you go to college if you are undocumented. So there's been this slew of laws that have been passed, and with these deportations, we're locking up more and more people. One group that's really benefited from this are the prison. The two big prison companies are doing very well. That we've gone from spending about $860 million a few years ago to lock up people, immigrants, to more than $2 billion a year. And increasingly, President Obama has also tried to recruit the police to act increasingly as immigration agents, and that's made life much more difficult. In addition to these laws that have been passed, that's made life very difficult for undocumented immigrants because, and there are two different programs. One kind of deputizes police officers to act as de facto immigration agents. So if they see you with a broken taillight or you've committed a more serious offense, they can pull you over and they can ask for your papers and they can hand you over to immigration agents. And then the other measure that will probably result in deportations continuing to increase in the next year or so is that President Obama wants every single police department by 2013 to sign up for something called Secure Communities. And that asks every police department, if they arrest you for misdemeanor on up, they fingerprint you, they send that to the FBI, but now they're also sending it to the Department of Homeland Security. And if you are here unlawfully, they hand you over to immigration agents. So that has been kind of part of what's been happening around the country. More and more, all of this is going to be sorted out ultimately. All of these laws that are being promulgated at the local and state level are going to be, and have already beginning to be decided by the courts. This is all going to be sorted out over the next few years. The courts are striking down a lot of what's been passed, but they are allowing some of, for example, just yesterday, the state of Florida actually said that if you are a citizen of this country and you have been raised in Florida, but your parents are undocumented, you cannot get in-state tuition. Yesterday, the courts struck that down. They said if you're a citizen, if you were born in this country, you should have the rights of any citizen, no matter what your parents are. But the courts have allowed Arizona's very famous measure to go through for now, which allows the police to pull over people and ask them, it's called papers, please provision. And if you find that someone has, you pull them over for some other reason, and it's been found in Arizona that they do find reasons to pull you over if you look like me, that you can ask people for their papers and turn them over to ICE. That was upheld recently by the Supreme Court. And they also have upheld something called E-Verify, which says that locals or state or local governments can tell employers, if you hire someone, you have to run that person's information through a computerized federal system and see if the social security number and the name of the person match up. And if they don't, then you can't hire that person, and that's been also upheld. So this will all be, this will all be churning, I'm sure, for several years in the courts, all of these different measures that have been passed, and we'll see how a lot of these things ultimately come out. But it's definitely something that's going to be in the news for the coming few years. So let me read you maybe the first passage, which I wanted to read three, which are my favorites in Enrique's journey. And the first one is when Enrique's mother leaves him. The boy does not understand. His mother is not talking to him. She will not even look at him. Enrique has no hint of what she is going to do. Lourdes knows, she understands, as only a mother can, the terror she is about to inflict, the ache Enrique will feel, and finally the emptiness. What will become of him? Already he will not let anyone else feed or bathe him. He loves her deeply, as only a son can. With Lourdes, he is openly affectionate. Dame pico, mami. Give me a kiss, mom, he pleads over and over, pursing his lips. With Lourdes, he is a chatterbox. Mira, mami. Look, mom, he says softly, asking her questions about everything he sees. Without her, he is so shy. It is crushing. Slowly, she walks out onto the porch. Enrique clings to her pant leg. Beside her, he is tiny. Lourdes loves him so much. She cannot bring herself to say a word. She cannot carry his picture. It would melt her resolve. She cannot hug him. He is 5 years old. They live on the outskirts of Tegucigalpa in Honduras. She can barely afford food for him and his sister, Belki, who is 7 years old. She's never been able to buy them a toy or a birthday cake. Lourdes, who's 24, scrubs other people's laundry in a muddy river. She goes door to door selling tortillas, used clothes, and plantains. She fills a wooden box with gum and crackers and cigarettes, and she finds this spot where she can squat on a dusty sidewalk next to the downtown Pizza Hut and sell the items to passers-by. The sidewalk is Enrique's playground. They have a bleak future. He and Belki are not likely to finish grade school. Lourdes cannot afford uniforms or even pencils. Her husband is gone. A good job out of the question. Lourdes knows of only one place that offers hope. As a 7-year-old child delivering tortillas her mother made to wealthy homes, she glimpsed this place on other people's television screens. The flickering images were a far cry from Lourdes' childhood home, a 2-room shack made of wooden slats, its flimsy tin roof weighted down with rocks, the only bathroom a clump of bushes outside. On television, she saw New York City's spectacular skyline, Las Vegas's shimmering lights, Disneyland's magic castle. Lourdes has decided she will leave. She will go to the United States and make money and send it home. She will be gone for 1 year, less with luck, or she will bring her children to be with her. It is for them she is leaving, she tells herself, but still she feels guilty. She kneels and she kisses Belki and she hugs her tightly. Then she turns to her own sister. If she watches over Belki, she will get a set of gold fingernails from El Norte. But Lourdes cannot face Enrique. He will remember only one thing she says to him. Don't forget to go to church this afternoon. It is January 29th, 1989. His mother steps off the porch. She walks away. ¿Dónde está mi mami? Enrique cries over and over. Where is my mom? His mother never returns, and that decides Enrique's fate. As a teenager, indeed still a child, he will set out for the United States on his own to search for her. Virtually unnoticed, he will become one of an estimated 48,000 children who enter the United States from Central America and Mexico each year, illegally and without either parent. Roughly 2/3 of them will make it past the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. So that's kind of the beginning of the story where Enrique's mother leaves him, and then, of course, he sets off from that same porch 11 years later in his quest to go and find her, and makes this incredible journey on top of freight trains in his desire to be with his mom again. And I still see these children, as I travel the country speaking, they come up to me and say, I just made this journey on top of freight trains to come find my own mother. And in fact, since reporting this story, this journey has gotten much more dangerous. And as you read, you'll see the many dangerous moments that Enrique will face, the many life-threatening moments that he will face on this journey. And I'll talk tonight about the journey I made on top of these freight trains for 3 months, trying to write the story in as great a detail as possible to make you feel like you're sitting on that train next to him, experiencing that journey as he did. I would never make this journey today because in addition to all the actors that I talk about, the gangsters, the bandits, the corrupt cops that were trying to hunt down Enrique as he went along, now the Zetas, the worst narco-trafficking group in Mexico, controls the train tops as well. And they are kidnapping about 20,000 Central Americans each year off the trains. And they use the little slip of paper that these children carry with their mother's telephone number on it. Usually that's the only thing these kids have on them. And they use that slip of paper to call the relatives in the United States and demand ransom from the relatives, you know, $1,000 to $5,000. I talked to a boy in Houston the other day who had 5 different relatives hit up for money for a total of $7,000, and they beat him for 2 months until they finally released him. And he was lucky. Most of them just get killed by the Zetas when they pay the ransom money, and especially if they don't pay the ransom money. So if anything, this journey has gotten more dangerous. Let me read the passage about the one of the most difficult moments for Enrique on this train as he journeys to try and find his mother. It is night. He is riding on a freight train. A stranger climbs up the side of the ladder of his tanker car and asks for a cigarette. The man moves quickly, but Enrique is not alarmed. Sometimes migrants riding on the trains climb from car to car to move forward or backward. Trees hide the moon, and Enrique does not see 2 men who are behind the stranger or 3 more creeping up the other side of the ladder. Scores of migrants cling to the train, but no one is within shouting distance. One of the men reaches a grate where Enrique is sitting. He grabs Enrique with both hands. Someone seizes him from behind. They slam him face down. All 6 surround him. "Take off everything," one says. Another swings a wooden club. It cracks into the back of Enrique's head. "Hurry," someone demands. The club smacks his face. Enrique feels someone yank off his shoes. Hands paw through his pant pockets. One of the men pulls out a small scrap of paper. It is his mother's telephone number. Without it, he has no way to locate her. The man tosses the paper into the air. Enrique sees it flutter away. The men pull off his pants. His mother's number is inked inside the waistband, but there is little money. Enrique has less than 50 pesos on him, only a few coins that he gathered begging. The men curse and fling the pants overboard. The blows land harder. "Don't kill me," Enrique pleads. "Shut up," someone says. His cap flies away. Someone rips off his shirt. Another blow finds the left side of his face. It shatters 3 teeth. They rattle like broken glass in his mouth. The men pummel him for what seems like 10 minutes. The robbery has turned into a blood sport. One of the men stands over Enrique, straddling him. He wraps the sleeve of a jacket around Enrique's neck and starts to twist. Enrique wheezes, coughs, gasps for air. His hands move feverishly from his neck to his face as he tries to breathe and buffer the blows. "Throw him off the train," one man yells. Enrique thinks of his mother. He will be buried in an unmarked grave, and she will never know what happened. "Please," he asks God, "don't let me die without seeing her again." The man with the jacket slips. The noose loosens. Enrique struggles to his knees. He has been stripped of everything but his underwear. He manages to stand, and he runs along the top of the fuel car, desperately trying to balance on the smooth, curved surface. Loose tracks flail the train from side to side. There are no lights. He can barely see his feet. He stumbles. Then he regains his footing. In half a dozen strides, he reaches the rear of the car. The train is rolling at nearly 40 miles an hour. The next car is another fuel tanker. Leaping from one to another at such a speed, it would be suicidal. Enrique knows he could slip, fall between them, and be sucked under. He hears the men coming. Carefully, he jumps down onto the coupler and holds the cars together, just inches from the hot, churning wheels. He hears the muffled pop of gunshots, and he knows what he must do. He leaps from the train, flinging himself outward into the black void. So that's one of the most difficult moments on the train for Enrique, and then I want to finish by reading one of the most wonderful moments, which for me was also one of the most wonderful moments in what was often a very trying time riding on top of these freight trains. And I'll talk more about, you know, the good and bad parts of it tonight. And maybe I should say that there were many wonderful parts for me of spending months on top of these trains trying to reconstruct Enrique's story. There were mystical moments on top of that train where, you know, it would be the middle of the night and there would be 100 migrants on top of this train and me, and everyone would be singing to try to stay awake so you wouldn't fly off this moving freight train, and I would be in a cloud of millions of fireflies. Or I remember this photograph was taken right before Mexico City at dawn, and as the sun came up, there was all this fog, and the fog was starting to lift, and I could see off to the right the pre-Aztec pyramids of Teotihuacan. So there were some amazing moments on this train, but also such terrible moments on the train for me that they required 6 months of therapy to be able to sleep again. So, but this for me was, in Veracruz, the people who helped the migrants was to me the most uplifting part of this journey. Not long after seeing the statue of Jesus, Enrique is alone on a hopper. Night has fallen, and as the train passes through a tiny town, it blows its soulful horn. He looks over the side. More than a dozen people, mostly women and children, are rushing out of their houses along the tracks, clutching small bundles. Some of the migrants grow afraid. Will these people throw rocks? They lie low on top of the train. Enrique sees a woman and a boy run up alongside his hopper. "Órale, chavo, here, boy," they shout. They toss up a roll of crackers. It is the first gift. Enrique reaches out. He grabs with one hand but holds tightly to the hopper with the other. The roll of crackers flies several feet away, bounces off the car, and thumps to the ground. Now women and children on both sides of the track are throwing bundles to the migrants on tops of the trains. They run quickly and aim carefully, mostly in silence, trying hard not to miss. "Ahí va uno," there's one. Enrique looks down. There are the same woman and boy. They are heaving a blue plastic bag. This time, the bundle lands squarely in his arms. "Gracias, adios," he calls into the darkness. He isn't sure the strangers who pass by in a flash even heard him. He opens the bag. Inside are half a dozen rolls. Enrique is stunned by the generosity. In many places where the train slows in Veracruz, at a curve or to pass through a village, people give. Sometimes 20 or 30 people stream out of their homes alongside the rails toward the train. They wave, they smile, they shout, and then they throw food. The town of Encinar, Fortín de las Flores, Cuichapa, and Presidio are particularly known for their kindness. A young Honduran immigrant, Fernando Antonio Valle Recarte, points at the ground in Veracruz. Here, he says, the people are good. Here, he says, everyone gives. So I'll stop there, and I hope you all have a lot of good, thank you. I hope you all have some questions here in the San Luis Valley. I know that this is an area with many Latinos and a long history of Latinos back to Spain and Mexico and far further back than LA, where I live. So, yes?
Do you still talk to Enrique, or still?
I do still talk to Enrique. He called me a few weeks ago. I talk more with Lourdes than to Enrique. I'm trying to tread on I'm trying not to give away too much of the book. Usually, many colleges assign the book and you all read it in the summer, but I understand you all are just starting, so I don't want to give away a lot of the ending. But I do talk a lot to them. Once you finish the book, there's an update about them on the website, and he's in the middle of a huge struggle right now that will be decided in the next 2 or 3 months. So look at the end of the semester, and his life will have a very drastic change in the next few months. So look then, and I'll put another update there after that happens. And I can't discuss it because discussing it might put him in danger. So that's the one area in which I become a bad journalist and I withhold information. I've stunned you all. Here we go.
Going back to your beginning about immigration.
Sure.
When you hear somebody say to you, or you hear it said, but they're illegal, what part of illegal don't you understand?
Yeah.
Or we live by a land of laws or the rule of law.
Right.
So Americans stand on those two issues, and they want to defend what, just they're illegal. So
right.
Why don't you understand that we should ship them all out?
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
What do you say to
Well,
what are
I
your
think
feelings about that?
Yeah, sure. And as you'll see tonight, I have very mixed views about the immigration issue. I see it as an issue with many shades of gray, that there are winners and losers, and I'll discuss that. And I basically say I disagree with the approaches of both the left and the right and point to a third way, and I'll talk about that more in depth tonight. But I would say, I guess, first that we're a country of many values, and the rule of law is one of those values, but we're also a country of great compassion. And I think sometimes those values should all be considered when we decide what to do about certain issues. That we shouldn't exclude other values when we discuss the value of the rule of law. I'm a big proponent of laws. When I was 13 years old, my father died, and my mother took us all back to Argentina, just as the dirty war was starting there. And I lived in a country with no laws, and I saw family members picked up and tortured, and I saw friends killed. And so I'm probably a bigger proponent of laws than most people in this room, having lived through, a society which didn't have a whole lot of laws, and the military could really do whatever it wanted, and there was no habeas corpus, and you could disappear, and that was the end of it. But I also think, I spent a lot of time in places that are much more hostile than Colorado to undocumented immigrants, Arizona, North Carolina. I think Colorado's kind of in the middle, not as friendly as California perhaps, but not out there like Arizona and Alabama. And I think one thing I also say is, sometimes the rhetoric has reached the point where coming to this country without permission, which is treated as a civil offense, is discussed as if it's akin to killing someone, And so I think we need to keep the rhetoric in check, because when you get that kind of rhetoric, you get more and more hate crimes occurring, and I don't think that's a good thing. So I think that's important to discuss as well. And I think if you really want to do something about reducing illegal migration, I'm not sure that the approaches of people who say the law is the law, greater border enforcement, have been very effective. And so I would say that if that is the approach that you want to take to the exclusion of everything else, then I would say to people that you need to work on creating jobs in these places that are sending the majority of people, because really that's the only thing that's going to long-term slow down this flow.
Just a little comment.
Sure. But I like laws.
I was right about these things too.
Sure.
About a year ago, or maybe a year and a half, I was in that computer lab, and there were 2 young students over here working on a project, and I overheard they were working on a project of immigration. And they said, what the do we have to do this for?
Right.
We should kill them all.
Kill
them all.
Right.
And oh, that really hit me so hard, because it just shows we can't stop educating people.
Right.
Because if that's how they feel about these human beings, they're not cucarachas.
Right. And there was a legislator in Alabama who said publicly, "I will do everything short of shooting them." And so I think that, you know, that sentiment is perhaps not that strong, but I've heard family members of my husband express sentiments that are not too far from that. And so I certainly have heard that point of view. I think what's been wonderful for me in terms of, this has been one of the most popular books nationwide as a common read. 60 colleges have used it so far. And what's great is that all the freshmen have to read it, not kids who are in Latin American studies, or everybody is subjected to this. And what so I'm not preaching to the choir. And so what I see very often is students who come up to me, and I was just discussing this with Linda, students who say, you know, I was raised very racist. I had a definite point of view on immigrants. I had never heard any of the other side on this issue, or even the middle on this issue. And the book and the class discussions, they say, you humanized immigrants. Now, I think that that's an odd thing to say, but this takes you inside one immigrant family, and I think it's hard, you know, even Lou Dobbs on CNN was very nice to me because, you know, I almost fell off my chair, but this is a boy going to find his mother. Who can argue with that, right? So I think by taking people inside one immigrant family, you make people stand in these women's shoes and say, you know, what if you happened to be born in Honduras or Mexico, and you had 2 kids and they were hungry and you had nothing to give them, and you knew that you could go to the north and, you know, feed them, and they could study past the 3rd grade. Wouldn't you consider doing the same thing? And I think a lot of people can understand that. And so I get students coming up to me and saying, I was raised very racist, and this book and class discussions have changed my views about this. So I got that from a skinhead in Arizona. If you can get that from a skinhead in Arizona, I think there's hope. So I don't understand it when I hear that about any human being, but yeah. Troubling, yes.
Drugs has not been successful and has exacerbated a lot of these problems. If drugs were legalized, would most of these issues go away?
You know, I think that's something, I've written a lot about drug addiction, and I think that's something, you know, there's great debate in Latin America about this right now. The president of Uruguay is basically openly advocating for legalization of marijuana. I think few people know this, but Honduras, where Enrique is from, has the highest homicide rate in the world. It is 5 times what Mexico is. So take what you've read about Mexico and amplify that. And a lot of that is that all of these drugs from Peru and Colombia are being funneled now through Central America. And, you know, I think some people believe that the solution would be to legalize at least marijuana. I have to tell you that when I was in college, the penalty for owning a small amount of marijuana went up, I think, from it went up from a misdemeanor to a felony, I believe. And a lot of my friends who used to smoke stopped smoking because they didn't want that potentially on their record. And so I have seen personally that if you legislate something about drugs, it can be a deterrent for some people. On the other hand, I grew up partly in Argentina where, you know, you grow up as a child drinking wine at the dinner table. And so, you know, when kids go to college in Argentina, they don't have to get drunk to the point that, you know, they're floating in the swimming pool, or they're in the hospital, or they're dead, which is too often the case here in the United States. I've seen that with my own, you know, nieces and nephews. So, I think also a big part of the equation is the demand in the United States for drugs. And you all, in using drugs, any students here, are part of the problem, because if there wasn't this huge demand for drugs in the United States, all of this violence would not be occurring south of the border, and all of these people would not be dying as a result of this. So I think we use more drugs here than anywhere else in the world. There's a problem, and so I think we need to acknowledge that and think about drug use and what the consequences are, and think about having more drug treatment programs so that people can get help if they are addicts. It's a disease. Being addicted to drugs, and I've seen this very close up in my reporting. And I think until you get help for many people, including Enrique, it's very hard to get away from it. In the back.
Well, thanks for being here, because this is just enlightening, and I love the time, because you know what, we as human beings are all on a journey. If you ask each one of us here in this place how many were born here, we are all immigrants in one form or another.
Right.
And I think the biggest challenge that we have is to be able to acknowledge and turn around and say to your neighbor, hey, welcome, you know, let's work together, let's stop all of this CRAP.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I do think that the world has changed since, you know, my husband's German and Scottish and English ancestors came 3 generations ago to Denver. I do think our economy has changed, and there are things that have changed, and so it is complicated in terms of, you know, I think we should have a legitimate debate about who should we allow into this country, what benefits the United States the most. Should we take a model that's more like Canada, where in terms of legal migration we go for high-skilled people? The United States largely is based on family reunification, our legal migration, and so if you have someone who's here already legally, we allow them to bring immediate family, and that's 2/3 of our legal migration is family, versus Canada does more, what do we need to drive our economy and what skills do we need to drive our economy? So it's a different approach, and I think we can have a very legitimate debate about who should we allow in legally, what levels do we want, how do we deal with illegal migration. But I think it's important to recognize that, you know, these are your new neighbors here in Colorado, and you've gone from 30,000 undocumented in 1990 to about, it went up to 240,000, now it's about 180,000. So Colorado has been one of the states where undocumented immigration has declined. Some people have left the state. But still, it's the 12th largest undocumented population per state in the United States. So it's fairly high, and you've seen, you know, a lot of legislation in Colorado reflecting that. There's been, I think people who are pro have, you know, tried 5 times to promote in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants in Colorado. There was an attempt to pass a law that would allow the police to pull over people. That was not passed in Colorado, so an Arizona-type law was not passed. I mean, you're the home of Tom Tancredo, who ran on an anti-illegal immigration presidential campaign. So I think you have, you know, all of those elements here in Colorado, but they are your neighbors here, and they are working out in those mushroom and potato fields, and you should know who your neighbors are. Know who people are before you hate them. That's kind of the most basic level. I have so many students who come up to me and say, I just hate them. I'm like, do you know an immigrant? No. Have you ever talked to one? No. So.
I know I have students who have great questions.
There's one here. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is in your book, but out of the thousands of kids who traveled to America, why did you pick him?
Why did I pick him? Well, so at the time, in 2000, when I started reporting this, I was looking for, well, ideally I wanted to start with a kid in Central America and travel with him. But it became clear very fast that I couldn't do that. I couldn't. I interviewed these twins in a detention center for kids in the United States, and they had been separated from each other 4 times in the process of coming through Mexico because they were running from the bandits and the gangsters of the cops. And I was like, I'm going to lose them, and I can't run as fast as, you know, a 15-year-old. So I decided to find a kid who had already made it to northern Mexico and hope that he might make it on to his mother, and then go back and retrace his journey. And I knew that as a journalist, I'm trying to tell the typical story. So at the time, the kids that ICE was catching, the average age was 15 years old. 80% of them were boys. Now it's about 3/4. And so I wanted a 15-year-old going on the trains, going for his mom, and so that's what I was looking for. on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border. So I figured out, well, what are all the churches and shelters that help these kids on our 2,000-mile-long border with Mexico? And I started calling them up every day, and I said, this is what I'm looking at, a 15-year-old boy going to train, going for mom, what have you got? A nun put Enrique on the line in Nuevo Laredo. And I really liked him. He was open. He had almost died on top of the train. That sounds odd to say it that way, but his experiences were very typical. He had spent 2 months at that point trying to get through Mexico. And he was willing. He was willing for me to tag alongside him. So what I didn't like was that he had started his journey when he was 16 and he was now 17. I thought he was too old. But I thought, well, I'll go to Nuevo Laredo. There's a lot of kids coming through that church. I'll hang with Enrique and I'll look for my ideal younger child. And then I got there and I realized that he was a glue sniffer, and I thought, oh, that's a big problem. Because I thought I needed a little angelito, a little angel that you could love, you know, not a glue sniffer who was 17 years old. So I kept searching, but all of these kids coming through the shelter had been robbed by the gangsters on the train of their little slip of paper. And most of them either didn't have a telephone in their little pueblito, their town, or hadn't thought to memorize it because they didn't use telephones that much. So they were realizing after months of travel, they were going to have to go back to the beginning, get that number again, and start all over again. At a certain point, I was talking to my editor at the LA Times, beating my head against the wall, trying to find my 15-year-old angel, and he said, well, you know, why is Enrique a glue sniffer? And I said, well, you know, this is pretty typical for these kids. If you're left in your home country and you're passed from relative to relative, you know, you tend to get into trouble. And Enrique did. He turned to drugs. And he said, you know, you don't want to write about a little angel. The best characters in literature are not angels. They're deeply flawed. We cannot identify with an angel because we aren't angels. So go with Enrique, for God's sake. And it was at that point that I kind of, you know, threw in the towel and said, okay, let's write about this kid. And I had spent a couple of weeks following him, you know, on and off on the Rio Grande before he crossed. And so he had told me about his 8 attempts to try to cross Mexico. And it was after that that I went back and retraced his journey. So I went reluctantly with Enrique. And he was not the easiest subject because I don't know if you've ever tried to interview a teenage boy. Not the most verbal subjects. I'll take a teenage girl any day over a teenage boy. And so, you know, there were points where I felt like I was just, you know, and he would say, no more, I can't take any more. How many questions can you possibly have? This happens, by the way, with almost any subject that you write about long, you know, in depth. I've spent a year with a woman now, and she's asking me the same question. So they get really annoyed and tired of you. Yes?
As an observer, how hard was it to just watch everything that was going on? And what would be the closest point where you intervene in a situation?
I always dread this question. So let me give you a little background to my decision-making on this. I had written a series of stories called Orphans of Addiction that looked at the 1 in 5 kids in America who grows up with a parent who's addicted to drugs or alcohol. And I had spent a lot of time with a 3-year-old girl whose mom was a heroin addict and crack addict. While I spent time with this girl, and there was a photographer with the LA Times there with me, she was neglected. She was left alone at times by her mother when she was desperate to get her fix. When she was alone, I watched her walk across some shards of glass to get to the kitchen. There was once when her boyfriend, and I wasn't there, but the photographer was, the mom's boyfriend asked the mom, can I brush your little girl's teeth with your toothbrush? Mom said yes. Mom is HIV positive. Photographer took a shot of this. When that photo ran in the LA Times, I cannot tell you how many toothbrushes I got in the mail telling me exactly what to do with those toothbrushes. People felt that I should have, as soon as I had met this girl, I should have intervened and I should have turned her into child welfare authorities and acted. And I didn't. I felt that she was neglected, but she was not in imminent danger. And I also saw that by telling a story in a certain way, it brought about very positive consequences for that girl, for her mother who got free drug treatment for 18 months, and created these huge systemic changes in terms of how child welfare authorities dealt with these children. Child welfare hotlines were revamped around the country, and I could tell you a lot of other great things that happened as a result of that story. But that story made me really think through very carefully, when do I intervene? When do I pull the trigger and not act as a journalist, but act as a human being, as some people would say. I can tell you, some people were just brutal with me on that story. Some people were very laudatory and said, look at all these things that happened. Other people wrote to me and said, I hope that you put the award that you so covet in the void that is clearly your heart. So that just gives you a sense. Some people called me 3 times in the middle of the night, said, I have reported you to the cops and really want them to come and arrest you, and I'm going to keep reporting you, So people felt very strongly about this. So with Enrique's journey, for me, it's clear that reporters do not get involved with the people that they write about, because my job is to write the story that I see, write reality, not change reality and then write about it. That's considered dishonest to my readers. And also, if I help people either financially or in other ways, that can sometimes, like the National Enquirer pays people for information, reputable news organizations do not. And that's because sometimes if you pay people for information, they will alter it to give you what they think you want to hear. So there are legitimate reasons for why journalists have these lines where they're not supposed to get involved or help the people that they write about. For me, the line was, is someone in imminent danger? If they are in imminent danger, then I help them, but I don't use anything after that because I've changed the story. And so during Enrique's journey, as I was reporting, there was a 15-year-old girl who had just been gang raped on the river in Oaxaca, next to the river. I had been in that same spot the day before. Luckily, had not been gang raped there. And I interviewed her in her jail cell, and from across the way, through the bars, the 2 guys who had gang raped her were yelling, when we all get deported back across the border to Guatemala, our homies control that town, they're going to finish you off. I made sure that Karen was not deported to that town because I felt her life was in danger. But with Enrique, I'm following him for 2 weeks on the Rio Grande, and on the Mexican side of the river, and he is struggling to come up with money, $10 to come up with a phone card, pay for a phone card, to call Honduras to try to get his mom's phone number again so he can continue on his journey. And I've got a cell phone in my purse the whole time. I don't offer it to him. That would change the course of his story. If he was in imminent danger, I would have helped him, but then it would have been Juan's journey or someone else's journey. So that's, I try to think through these ethical dilemmas. I thought, for example, when I might find a boy and end up walking to San Antonio, which is a 5-day walk from Nuevo Laredo, where I was with Enrique. And, I'm going to have to cross the river. And I'm a former lifeguard, but I know that there are whirlpools that suck you under. I'm going to have a life vest on. At what point do I intervene with the kid? If he's struggling a little bit, if he's struggling a lot? I mean, obviously, if he's drowning and I'm not drowning, I'm going to help him. But I try to think through all those scenarios. I had there was a bumper crop of rattlesnakes that year, and they come out to hunt at night. And that's when migrants are on the move without flashlights. So I had a snake bite kit, and I had iodine pills because you can only carry 2 jugs of water, and you can't walk 5 days with 2. You're going to go through that in 1 day. So I was going to have to drink out of cattle troughs, and I had iodine pills. Would I share those things? So I tried to think through as much as possible, where would I draw the line? Where was imminent danger for these migrants? I had a compass. If I knew the migrants were going north when they should be going south, what would I do? So because of my previous experiences, I really tried to think through what would I do in that instance, because what I learned with the toothbrush is that bad things happen quickly, and you have to know how, in advance, how you're going to react. Let me just finish by the question by saying, for me, despite all the terrible things I went through, the most difficult part of this journey was that every day 30 or 40 people would ask me for food or for help. And largely I said no. I believe that there is a power in me being in the middle of the story, watching as that story unfolds, that there's an immediacy and power to telling a story in that way, and hopefully by doing it in the most compelling way possible, I can write a story that you'll want to read and educate yourself about an issue and maybe even do something about it. And that is what has happened with Enrique's journey. But it's sometimes hard to explain what journalists do and why they do it. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes?
Does the power or the potential power of your storytelling, is that enough to sustain you in the midst of, it sounds like some pretty dark issues that you're exploring, not only the immigration issue, but drug addiction, other things that you get into as a journalist. Is the story enough to keep you going, to keep you from just getting deflated, seeing all this, this kind of stuff? It's just difficult.
Yeah, and as a journalist, I would try to alternate some between, I've written about how suicide is working its way into younger ages, 11 and 12-year-olds, and when I would do a story like that, I tried to do something a little lighter afterwards. But I've spent my career writing about big social issues, and those tend to be knotty, difficult, sometimes depressing issues. And for me, the challenge, I love it because a lot of reporters spend their lives, especially now as the newsrooms have shrunk. I mean, my former employer, the LA Times, has a third to half of the staff that they used to have. So people can't afford to really leave their desks. They're calling people on the phone all the time. And for me, the joy is being out in these places and constantly learning. I love that. And a lot of reporters, they cover a beat. They specialize in one thing. They get to know it really well. They're more productive as a result than I am. I go from one thing that I know nothing about to another thing that I know nothing about. And that really helps keep me engaged. And I look for stories. I look for a lot of elements in stories. I look for a universal theme. Here it's a boy willing to go through anything to reach his mother, greed, whatever those universal themes are that I and anyone else can identify with. I look for great characters, I look for a great narrative arc, but mostly I look for something that moves me on an emotional level. And for me, when I first heard about these kids, these mothers leaving their children and being apart from them for so long, the sign for me is the hair goes up on my forearm. And that tells me that it's a story that's moving me on an emotional level and will sustain me through a lot of these things. And I also, I see some incredible good as I go along. I mean, the food throwers, the incredible heroes that I met along the tracks, some of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. I met in the most, depressing places. So that sustains me as well and keeps me going. Okay, one more here. Yes?
You, 5 to 10 years from now, do you see more states enacting more and more restrictive immigration laws like Arizona's SB 1070, or do you see it going more lenient?
We've already seen that although the number of pieces of legislation are roughly the same per year, which is more than 1,600 pieces on the state and local level every year, it's still roughly the same, but fewer of those pieces of legislation are passing. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that the economy is improving, and so people's hair is less on fire about this issue than it once was, and the number of people coming has declined. Of course, when the economy improves, it will go up. And there are debates among experts about will it go up to the levels we were seeing. I mean, in 2007, we were seeing 850,000 people coming here every year without permission. A huge number of people. Now we're at about 300,000 people a year. So some people believe that it won't go up to those levels because Mexico's GDP is twice the US right now, so they're doing better. Mexican women are having a lot fewer kids. They've gone from 7 kids to 2 kids in 3 decades. Fewer mouths to feed. So things are, despite the drug violence, things in some ways are better in Mexico. And so there's debate about will it go up to 850,000 or somewhere in between 300 and there. So I think that will cause less legislation. But I think also, you know, people like Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which had the first local law, Farmers Ranch, Texas, they've spent millions of dollars to take these cases to court because they get sued by the ACLU and other MALDEF and other groups. And in many cases, they've lost. And I think other states have seen that, and they're seeing the Supreme Court's reaction to a lot of these measures. Some of them are being upheld, like allowing the police to ask for papers. But the Supreme Court also said, you know, basically, show me, Arizona, that you can do this without discriminating against Latinos. And I think that's going to be a very tall order, because if you look at Maricopa County in Phoenix, the infamous sheriff there, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, I mean, one newspaper looked at the people that his deputies pulled over, and in a year and a half, they pulled over 669 people, and 665 of those were brown. So if you don't call that racial profiling, I don't know what it is. So I think it will be a high bar, and I think the ACLU and others are waiting, you know, to pounce on Arizona and get that declared unconstitutional, that one element that was upheld. So I think a lot of localities have seen that these measures are not passing muster with the courts, and so they're reticent to spend a lot of money right now when they don't have it. You know, I think a lot of them were doing this for political points, Republicans in particular, and but when they see that it's just not going to go through and they're spending all this money, then there is the potential for some backlash. So we're starting to see the economy improve and some of this diminish until the next recession comes. Mm-hmm.
I think she'll take one more question, so if you've been waiting to get your courage up, anyone? And also, I want to point out that the bookstore has copies of her book for sale here. It's 7 o'clock tonight, right, Linda? In McDaniel Hall 101. No parking limitations. That she'll be returning. I know you have slides to show us.
Yes, there will be visuals. I'll show photos of the journey, so that'll be great.
If you don't have your cash or checkbook now, also, there will be books available tonight as well. I don't know if you're willing to maybe sign
Absolutely,
for some
yeah.
folks. And maybe after this last question, you'll wait around a little while. We want to give her some time to recover before her next.
Okay.
Though it sounds like you could handle anything, but we'll.
Good to go.
So one more. Come on, Steve.
Ganas, come on. There's someone out there.
You have a role model here.
Here we go.
Yeah, my major concern is population. We have about 7 billion on the planet now that will sustain about 2 billion. And we've got a church population in Mexico that says, have as many children as you can.
Yep.
How are we going to change that?
I think we need to educate girls in places like Mexico and Central America. And I have seen schools that have read Enrique's journey come together to build one school in one town. 12% of Honduras has no school. And it's clear that when you educate, especially girls, they put off having children until they're older and they have fewer children. And so I think that is the most effective way to counter, and I have even advocated for this in Catholic churches where I have spoken, that it's the most, the Sierra Club has some deep concerns about unlawful migration because of how it will affect the population of the United States. And, I think, again, as with most issues in dealing with immigration, this is not clear cut. Some people say, and certainly when I'm on the freeways of Los Angeles, I agree, there are too many people in the United States. But other people would say that there are many rural communities that have really emptied out and have been brought back to life because migrants have come in, they have brought these towns back to life. They have been willing to work in the fields, they've been willing to work in these meat packing plants, and Americans are not willing to do some of those jobs. And so I think even on the population issue, you get different points of view here in the United States. But I think the most effective thing we can do is to promote birth control, which is tricky as a foreign entity to do this in places like Mexico. But certainly NGOs can do that, and we can indirectly help. You know, Mexico's rate of birth went way down because the government promoted family planning. And there are ways that non-governmental organizations can try to supplement or sustain what governments do in terms of trying to reduce the birth rate, but also in terms of trying to educate girls.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, thank you. You guys are a great audience. And I'm happy to sign any of your books if you'd like me to. I'll sit wherever.